West Penwith is a unique and ancient landscape lying right at the very tip of the UK. This iconic area of Cornwall is home to moorlands, meadows, rugged coastlines, ancient sites and communities of wildlife and people. The Penwith Landscape Partnership has uncovered many ancient sites, restored depleted habitats, engaged and connected with landowners, farmers, local communities and conservation organisations, enabling them to come together to reconnect the landscape for both people and wildlife. In this short series of podcasts, we explore the project's achievements and highlight how you can help us to preserve and protect the landscape for years to come. In this episode, Nick, the PLP Ecologist, and Phil, the PLP Farm Environment Officer, talk about farming in West Penwith.
I'm Nick Taylor from Penwith Landscape Partnership. I'm with Phil Pengelly and, well, Phil, you explain what you do and I'll explain my role in the project.
Right, thanks Nick. My name's Phil Pengelly. I'm the Farm Environment Officer for the Penwith Landscape Partnership. And my job involves liaising with farmers and helping them to work in a way that increases biodiversity, but also looks at healthy soils, water quality, and how they might be more sustainable into the future.
So I'm the ecologist and I manage two projects. I manage the Penwith Hedges projects and I also manage the Wild Penwith project, which is concerned with enhancing, protecting and raising awareness of the biodiversity of West Penwith, habitat connectivity, better land management. So Phil and I work on that project together. Am I right in thinking that some of those hedges are older than the pyramids, Nick? You would be right in saying that, Phil. Yes, that's right. So the landscape that we're lucky enough to work in is primarily a prehistoric landscape in agricultural terms. As you drive west down through Cornwall, it's like you're going backwards in time. The landscape is covered in a maze of Cornish hedges, and they are, technically speaking, a stone face earth-filled bank. It's interesting actually because the pattern of hedges that you can see as you drive through Cornwall, the archaeologists are able to date the landscape that they're looking at. So for example, fields tended to become more square in more recent times. So from the medieval period onward, this was when farming techniques changed. So straight hedges, straight field boundaries tend to be brought in when people started to plough and use oxen. And some fields you can even detect a curve at the end where the hedge was constructed so there was room for the ox to turn. When you get into Penwith, the hedges and field patterns become a lot more higgledy-piggledy, and we're going back into the Iron Age, even into the Bronze Age, or as Phil said, even before that. And some of the hedges in the Penwith landscape are thought to be the oldest structures in the world, which are still being used for their original function for which they were designed. So they were put up to mark out boundaries, to retain livestock, and they're still doing that job today. So some of the hedges are 4,000 years old. Extraordinary. Phil, tell us a little bit more about what your job, what do you actually do?
I spend a lot of my time speaking to farmers in groups or on a one-to-one basis. I suppose the way that we've worked with farmers in the first instance is to offer a free soil sampling service. So we've been able to offer a limited number of field samples to each farmer. So soils are very topical at the moment, vital to crop growth. They have a lot of subsidiary services as well, if you like, or qualities. So things like water absorption, carbon sequestration, retention of nutrients, all those sorts of things sort of come as a part of a package. So they're not just an inert medium, they're a living substance. You know, that's really important in terms of how you grow your crops, how you feed your livestock, how you prevent pollution, how you retain water, all those sorts of things.
So apart from soils, what else do you do, Phil?
So it's sort of the spin-off from that is also then water quality. So we've done a lot of work with farmers around things like fencing streams to prevent livestock polluting them through their droppings. We've also worked with farmers to aerate the soils. So we purchased an aerator, which helps to put more oxygen into the soil.
One of the lovely things about being a Heritage Lottery funded project is that we've got a pot of funding with which we've been able to do some really quite exciting experimental things. And so this leads me on to the no fence system.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think that's definitely quite exciting and worth
Sure.
talking about.
So going back a number of years, there was a move to fence some of the commons, particularly along the North Penwith coast. This met with some local resistance. The idea behind it being to let cattle graze on the moors to restrict the growth of gorse and things like that, which were a fire risk, and to encourage heather and more wild grasses. But people found it difficult to accept the infrastructure of the fences, which were there with a good intention, but unfortunately, prevented access or restricted access to places where people used to have free access.
And how would that open landscape have been managed in the past without fences?
So a word that comes to mind is hefted, which would be
Hefted,
which would be livestock being very used to living in a particular zone, and because it was generations of livestock living there, the older generation taught the younger generation the limits of their patch. That's still common today, particularly up in North England. And you've got to remember that, going back 100 years, there wouldn't have been any cars, so it wouldn't have mattered if the cow had crossed the lane. We live in a different, society with cars and not just one or two, but lots, particularly in the summer. So that's why they thought about putting in those infrastructures.
Oh, I see.
Cattle grids and fences. Anyway, so we came to the situation looking to solve an age-old problem, really. We did some research, and we came across a couple of systems, one in Australia, which we thought was too far away to buy, and one in Norway, which seemed a little bit closer. So we had the no-fence system. So it's a bit the size of a cowbell, and it sits around the cow's neck, and there's two parts to it. First, you've got the GPS part, so we can find the animal. There's a battery in there, and there's got solar cells built into the collar. Once I put them into the collar, they self-charge, even on a day like this, perhaps.
And then what do they do?
So there's two parts to that. So then there's a second part, which is the electronic fence. So I have my mobile phone, and I draw the boundary of the area I want them to graze.
So no real fence?
No fencing infrastructure whatsoever, all contained in the collar. So there I am with the farmer. I draw the pasture where I want them to eat. So if I have an archaeological feature, I can draw a circle around the archaeological feature as an exclusion zone to stop them going into that zone to damage the ancient monument. I then upload the program into the collars, and you now have a collar all powered by the GPS system that will contain the animals. So what you would do then is you would train the animals. You don't just turn them out onto the common and let them run. For a week or so, you train them in a traditional field with hedges, and you just make one side, so the middle of the field may be the fence boundary, and then you can move that up and down the field so they learn where the boundary is. And there's two parts to that. There's an audio sound, and there's also an electronic pulse. So the audio sound comes first, so as the animal gets nearer to the boundary, the collar plays them a tune. So and the closer they get, the faster the tune goes.
Right.
So it's all speed relative. So as they get closer and closer, then if they keep going, they get to the boundary, it delivers an electric pulse to the animal. The same principle as an electric fence.
So that's uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable, yes.
Yeah.
So then the animal will be, realise that that's as far as they should go. There's a safety system built into the collars, so it only delivers a maximum of 3 pulses, and then it shuts down. And then it changes on your screen. It changes from green to red.
So this is you, the farmer.
Yeah. So now if I look at my phone, I can see where my animal is, and oh dear, it's changed from green to red, which means it's escaped from my.
Oh, I see. That's very handy. Yeah.
So then I have to go and find it.
And so how's it working? Have you tested it out? How many people have had a go?
On several farms, and it's been very successful, really. It's beginning to be taken up, and nationally it's becoming very popular.
It's very exciting for me as an ecologist, because grazing livestock is a key habitat management tool, and to have this sort of versatility is really exciting. So, for example, if we had an area where there was perhaps a patch of rare orchids coming up, we could draw an exclusion zone around the orchids, and the livestock wouldn't go in and trample the orchids. So one of the things that's been really lovely about the project is we've been able to bring in our own experiences, skills, backgrounds, and it's been a really lovely kind of sort of melting pot of people with all sorts of different skills. My background is as a teacher, and before that as a zookeeper, and that has kind of informed my relationship with nature. I've had the opportunity to work alongside people who've got expertise in archaeology, in access, in all sorts of things. And so Phil, tell us a bit about your background, your story.
Yes, so I was born on a sort of mixed dairy farm, Praise, near Camborne. My family has spent the last 100 years ping-ponging between Praise and Sunbury. So I've been very fortunate to work in an area which I love, really.
Tell us about your farm. What farming have you?
So
what experience
my background is dairy, not just dairy farming, but dairy farming, pigs, beef, and then what I would call loosely Cornish cash crops, which are potatoes, cabbages, I better use the correct word, cauliflower, which we call broccoli, just to confuse the issue, and also cut flowers. So traditional sort of Cornish farm, sort of a little bit of everything.
How many farms are like that now? Are there many farms doing a little bit of everything still?
There's a few left. Economies of scale has meant that farms tend to specialise. The idea being that the bigger you get, the more efficient you are. And in terms of economics, that's in theory true. The downside of that is that if the price drops in the commodity which you are particularly involved in producing, then that can lead to
you've got all your eggs in one basket.
You've got all your eggs in one basket. So the traditional sort of mixed Cornish farm may have not made a fortune, but it was very unlikely that all the things that you did were going to go bad in the same year. So that was the idea.
Which is the better way to go then? Should you have all your eggs in one basket?
That's a very good question.
What would you advise farmers today?
Oh, well, on a personal level, I think it's probably better not to have all your eggs in one basket. But having said that, it does mean that there's lots of little jobs that need doing, which are perhaps less efficient. So,
yes.
It's a balance. And because there's less labour on farms, and labour is a really big issue, Nick.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense that you can't find it. I mean, when I was young, there'd be any number of local school children and other people that would come out and pick potatoes or pick flowers or do whatever the seasonal job was. And there's less willingness, I think.
Is it because it's not attractive? Is it because there's not people around, do you think?
I think there's two aspects to it, really. I think, firstly, there's the loss of connection between the local community and the farms. Do
you think this is going the other way, though? Because speaking from myself, I know that I would like to source, as much as possible, my food from as near as possible. I'd like to know the people that are producing it. And I imagine, I don't know whether that's a luxury to be thinking of it like that, but I would... Do you think there's opportunities for farmers to diversify
I do.
Engage with the local community?
But I think there is. But I think it's very, very important that farmers take time out to engage, particularly with schools and colleges. And I think what you got to remember was that many years ago, well, not many years ago, but a lifetime ago, in my dad's lifetime, many of the people that lived in the village worked on the farms. And, and a lot of people had their milk delivered by the local farmer, and perhaps they bought eggs off the local farmer. And so there was a connection. With the rise of supermarkets, people have gone to them rather than purchase locally, really, I suppose. And that's not to be looked down upon, but that's often an economic necessity.
The interesting thing, I think, though,
costs,
I, as an ecologist, can see that what I want to have from the farming landscape, what I require of farmers, is more than food, and on an equal level with I obviously, I mean, you said this yourself, haven't you, that the farmers' primary role is feeding the nation. That's how they see themselves.
That's been government policy.
Right.
Since the post-war. And
yes.
Immediately after the war, there wasn't any food. I mean, rationing ran until 1953, maybe 54. So, yeah, there was a desperate need for food post-war, and government policy was to encourage that. And rightly so, because, you've got to feed people. I suppose that probably the idea of landscape management became lost post-war because of the importance of food. Because at the end of the day, if you can't feed the nation, then
it feels to me though that the two things are so intertwined. We've got this concept now of, I think it's called public
goods.
Public goods. So from the landscape, we not only need food, but we also need clean drinking water. We need carbon capture. We need to have pollinating insects. And I think a healthy farming landscape can provide much more than just food. It provides many other things which are essential to the health of the nation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as I said, probably those other good outcomes became lost with the rush for cheap food production. Remember, we went back at the beginning, we were talking about balance in the soil, and it's a bit like balance in agricultural policy. So there's a balance to be found in all these things. And so, probably we've lent too far about producing cheap food at the cost of all the other things that land can provide. Access, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, all those things. And we've got to come back to a middle position where we're not tilting one way too much or not tilting the other way too much. It's a bit like walking a tightrope.
Yes.
So the government have now seen that there needs to be a change in don't forget that, government's a big driver in all these things. Farmers only follow where they're led, really. If they've got payments to do a particular thing, then the economic case will be to follow those payments. And so, when you're being paid to produce food cheaply, that's what you'll do. And if the payments change to lead you in another direction, then farmers, being business people, will follow that nudge from government policy.
So the Penwith landscape is a particular, we've touched upon this, was a particular type of landscape. It's a historic landscape. Yes. The soils are, generally speaking, fairly poor soils. So why would anybody bother to farm in Penwith?
I wouldn't wholly agree with that point of view, Nick.
I've got my own answers. I feel slightly provocative saying
that's
that.
But again, there's always history behind all these things, isn't there? So traditionally, Cornwall's been an area where there have been few frosts. We're very blessed to have a kind climate. So temperatures that allow crops to grow probably 11, maybe even 12 months of the year. And so, traditionally it's been an area which produced horticultural crops in the winter. With the coming of the railway lines, that opened up the chance to supply London and all the big cities. So Covent Garden, I can remember as a young person going down to St Earth railway station and it being filled with boxes of cut flowers and greenery and all manner of horticultural things to go on the train to go to London. So there's an economic driver again to produce out of season crops which feed the what was then an ever increasing urban population. So the west side of the UK is very good at growing grass. Humans can't utilise grass, but animals, ruminants particularly, can. And so, there's always that sort of nudge towards livestock production and all the things that come from that. So milk, meat, dairy products, cheese, wool, all the animal products, are an important part of managing the landscape and using what the landscape will produce. So that's why the agricultural industry developed as it has, perhaps in West Cornwall, but not just West Cornwall.
So how is it that West Cornwall has this prehistoric agricultural landscape? How has it managed to survive when other areas of the farming landscape at country might have had their fields enlarged, hedges removed? What has kept it like this? And is there any value to this landscape other than as a kind of living museum almost?
You can't balance farming without mining. And you can't balance farming without fishing. So, farming never existed in a sealed bottle. Traditionally, West Cornwall and not just West Cornwall, but much of Cornwall's been a mining area. And a lot of it has been, I suppose years ago, it was small holdings where a miner come farmer would work down the mine, but also have a subsistence level farm to feed probably what was a very large family. It's wouldn't be anything new, 10, 11, 12 children. And you can imagine the difficulty of bringing that up on a mining wage. You have to grow your food at home. So, there's all those things working together to make small holdings. And then obviously as time developed, those holdings got bigger. So there's a lot of history behind how that grew up. Again, back to economics, Nick.
So I want to propose or suggest that we're lucky to live in a beautiful landscape of historic value, great historic value. But the thing that I would suggest is that the landscape itself can offer a model for the future. And the way, as the person who is concerned with the preservation and promotion of the Cornish hedges, which are these stone earth-filled structures with plants, form a network across the countryside of fantastic biodiversity reserves. So they mean that the fields are small, which might make it more difficult in terms of machinery or the sort of efficiencies that you're talking about, but it means that you've got biodiversity very close to the crops, which provides beneficial pollinating insects, predatory insects, which will control pests. And also, going back to this thing that we talked about before, mob grazing, one of the things that it may well be a model for is that having a series of small fields like we have in West Cornwall isn't necessarily only useful in a sort of historic sense. It could well be, and probably was, the fact that the Iron Age people understood the concept of moving livestock around. So these small hedged fields are actually a model of what we might go back to in terms of the sort of the mob grazing.
I've got to get my favourite saying in it.
Go on then, go for it.
Well, I've always heard, and I guess this comes from an old tutor at Duchy College, and that's John Tozer, that you should live as though you're going to die tomorrow, but farm as though you're going to live for 1,000 years. So, all of what you're saying is important, Nick. Each generation, particularly if they've been farming a farm for 3, 4, 5 generations, has learned something about the farm and passed it on. So it's not a blank canvas. You come with that knowledge, and that's, to me, is the link to the landscape. Yes, I agree with you.
Now, I'm going to ask you to crystal ball gaze, Phil. What's the future of farming in West Penwith? What are the farms going to look like? What are the concerns of the farming community going to be going forward? And I know that's a really difficult, complex question.
Yes, I mean, there's lots of competing priorities, I suppose. I'll come back to labour. Labour is a big issue in the farming industry. So, I mean, whether you're for or against Brexit, I haven't got time to go down that avenue, but with less European labour being available, particularly in the horticulture, but not solely, but dairy as well, farmers have struggled to get their crops picked from the fields.
And what about the climate, Phil? I was at a meeting on Thursday evening, and a farmer was talking about how this summer was hotter and drier than anything he'd experienced before. And if this is going to happen often, which I fear it might, what impact will that have?
Obviously, again, we made a video about how to manage your stock in a dry summer, and that's available on our website. So farmers are looking at resilience. What different kinds of crops, what different kinds of pastures can they grow to allow there to be, basically green material in the fields for the animals to eat. So by using a variety of different plants, you produce fertiliser, but you also get benefits of things like helping to prevent parasites living in the animals. So stomach worms and that type of thing. So, and all those benefits sort of, and also bring up minerals. So if the grass grows in a particular zone of the soil, then you might find that another plant like ribwort plantain grows down a deeper root and is able to access some of the minerals down perhaps at 30 centimetres.
And maybe moisture.
Yep. So mix them all up and you get benefits in all different ways. And that's nothing new.
So that's herbal lays. Anything else that farmers might be looking at?
How can we increase soil carbon through perhaps increasing organic matter, so that there's a big revive in minimum cultivations, so min-till. Min-till, or even no-till. So, the idea being that you reduce the amount of ploughing that you do. Rather than plough every 3 years, maybe plough every 6 years. No, some people will not plough at all, so there's always going to be a place for ploughing. But perhaps on a reduced scale. So the downside of ploughing is that you destroy the soil structure to a certain extent. You release more carbon. But there are benefits. So you bury the weed seeds. You get rid of the old surface trash. So, there's a lot of trash left over after a crop. You bury it, which increases soil organic matter. So it's not all bad. But there's get back to our golf game, isn't it? Different clubs for different activities. So there's a big drive to disturb the soil less.
Now, at that point, Phil, there are so many things that I want to talk about, but we're running out of time.
Oh dear.
So I think we're going to have to.
Yes, we could probably talk on all afternoon.
We could. I'm particularly interested in this. How the landscape will be shaped by the changes in the climate. Obviously, government subsidies will have a huge impact, and the things that people want to see of their landscape. So. Excellent. I think we will leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Nick.
Next week, we have Victoria, the PLP Programme Manager, with a final word about the project. The Penwith Landscape Partnership is a 5-year project supported by National Lottery players through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. To find out more about our work and our partners, please head to penwithlandscape.com. For links and references from each episode, please refer to the show notes. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review on your podcast platform. Thanks for listening.